Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So we'll go ahead and do introductions as everybody comes in. From earlier, again, Doug Howard, CEO of Hondurans. My experience, I've done now 6 MSSP/MDR players, so a lot of experience in that space, but I've also ran IT and security for larger organizations like RSA, for example. So I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves. Yep.
Hi, everyone.
There you go.
Hello. So my name is Maria Afapomatides. I'm with Louis Brisbois. I joined in June of last year. Prior to that, I was with an insurance defense firm doing accountant liability. So I was very much enthralled in the world of accounting fraud. And I'm very happy to be here today. It's kind of a full circle moment for me because I grew up about a mile away from what used to be Shea Stadium. So very happy to be here and with everyone's company here today. So.
Rich Redder, I'm sharing the mic with her and hopefully not getting COVID anytime soon. With Will Sales, and been there for approximately 20 years or so, or trying to remember all those dates. And I'm a co-chair of the firm's data security and privacy team, and just happy to be here to share our opinions and thoughts with everyone.
We partner with small and medium-sized businesses to operate as their outsourced IT department and kind of fill in those gaps within, great to be here.
I'm Jason Gabrielson with Beasley Insurance. I've been doing claims for about 10 years. I've been with Beasley for the last 2, doing cyber claims, focusing on small business.
Okay, so anatomy of a breach, there's varying levels of people in the audience, so we're going to touch on a few areas, especially around what we're seeing in the industry, processes, and so forth. Dylan, you want to throw up the disclosure that now Rich has already said, so we'll leave that one off. But next slide. So before we get started, real quick, we have seen some trends in the marketplace, and I'll let these guys dive in is where they're comfortable. We saw in the beginning of the year a trend downward in the number of IR cases, and that's talking to a lot of our peers in the space too, not just in any particular section. Some of the insurance panels, would say that, hey, we deployed multi-factor authentication, we're getting less claims because of X, Y, and Z. We would argue that probably the disruption in the supply chain of malware has been the biggest interruption, and we are starting to see some of that come back. And so for those of you that are familiar with the space, the objective for the distribution of malware historically has included the ability for people to build this, then sell off the malware, and then people to deploy and take advantage of it. And so, because some of those set in Russia, some of those set in Ukraine, we've seen some siding there that disrupted that supply chain. So I don't know if anybody has any opinions or input.
I'll jump in just a little bit, just generically, with all kind of cyber activity, bad actors, they're going to try and take advantage of unfortunate situations. Not only are we seeing a little bit of a lull right now, but in the beginning of COVID, we saw an uptick in that, an uptick of malicious type malware and phishing because of that. And just because there's a lull right now doesn't mean that it's going to continue. And we'll definitely start to see more of that activity.
Okay, let's jump into the couple topic areas here. Okay, so we have seen some regulations, obviously, over the last couple of years, as well as recently at a state level, where payment of ransomware has been restricted in a number of different ways. And so North Carolina, for example, has a law now that you're not allowed to actually make ransomware payments. Obviously, we're all familiar with the federal requirements of who can be paid and the validation requirements associated with that. Any observations or changes that you guys have seen? Because this obviously influences the way that people are reacting to the actual breaches themselves.
So yeah, with the North Carolina law, I have not seen a claim. That kind of came to me from underwriting as a broker is asking if we can pay directly. So that was the question. The answer is no. But so it's really interesting. It's limited to public entities and agencies and such. I have not been involved with a claim yet. I'm trying to talk to a couple of people I know who I think are involved with a few things. But what's actually really interesting for me is that it not only forbids payment, but it also forbids communication with the threat actor. And the other part of it, though, is that I think they have this task force, and I did run into the task force prior to this law. There is, I think it's both state and federal, mostly law enforcement agencies that are kind of working together. And, you know, they kind of come in and they kind of tell you what to do. So this is not going to affect private businesses that much. The law, I think, does suggest that people, you know, the private business also contact the task force and let them know. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The proposition that, you know, banning these types of payments will be a deterrent. I personally don't know if that's going to work, but that's the concept. I think there's also laws in New York and Pennsylvania pending right now, you know, that they're being kicked around. Whether or not they'll make it out the other end, I don't know. I think that the one in New York may also potentially apply to private businesses, so that would be something to watch for sure.
And in the New York one, I guess the question there is, if you're doing business in New York but headquartered in another location, you're headquartered in New York but doing business in other locations, any thoughts about how that might evolve? It's a opinion.
Oh, yeah. It sounds like a big mess. I mean, that's my first thought. Yeah, I mean, you know, on the insurance claim side, it would play a lot of issues. I mean, when we look at, you know, our obligations of the policy, we're usually looking to the law that's written out. You know, it's almost a, you know, sort of choice of law type of analysis there, you know, if the insured is looking to make a payment. Again, you know, from a claims perspective, we're usually in a reimbursement position. So we do have a little bit of ability to kind of try to figure, you know, we have a little bit more time to try to figure it out, as long as the insured will let us try to figure it out before they sue us for not payment. But it's
Yeah, but the other thing is, I don't necessarily think that the threat actor is going to go ahead and see who cannot pay a ransomware payment, right? And so if you want to necessarily bar it maybe as a wholesale approach, right, that might be something that would be more of a deterrent to the threat actor, right? Because if we're not going to get paid, and if it's only for financial gain, then we're not going to do it. But I just don't see them going through like an encyclopedia trying to figure out, you know, how to interpret the law and whether this organization or that one will be subject to it.
I'm going to agree with you. A lot of times we observe that the threat actors are typically lazy, and that, you know, there's a lot of smash and grabs. They're not going to sit there and research and be the lawyers of the case, right? That's what we do. But yeah, I think it'll be a little bit of a messy situation, and it, you know, ultimately the company or the entity itself that's suffering the breach is they're being re-victimized in a way if they're not in the position to resolve the matter fully in that respect.
Yeah, I guess the one
Opinion, that was my opinion.
Again, and this is definitely an opinion question, by the way. So, I guess the one thing that could happen as a downstream result of this, if New York says no ransomware payments, that could impact the insurance premiums, which are heavily driven by ransomware.
just a thought here. So not too long after the Colonial Pipeline stuff, I had something come across my desk, and that was, you know, everybody was kind of checking the news and stuff to see what was going on. There seemed to be a lot of government activity going on. And, I had something hit me with a small insurer, kind of a low five-figure demand. It was an unknown variant, some entity that we hadn't heard before. But our antennas were up just because of everything. And like a lot of threat notes, they said, you know, don't contact the police or something. But I also said, you know, it took it a level higher and said, you know, also if you work with a negotiator or you contact, you know, authorities or anything, we will immediately delete your data. So I kind of thought, well, maybe this is sort of that next evolution. Low, you know, kind of a demand that, you know, that business could maybe handle on its own without insurance or, you know, everything that kind of comes with it. And, you know, just this this demand, if you get anybody involved, we're blowing it all up. So that was, I haven't seen anything like that since, but.
The other aspect is, and I'm sure it will have some type of impact in terms of how the underwriters and the brokers rate the actual risk, right? But just because you're borrowing the ransomware payment doesn't mean you're borrowing coverage for potentially the business interruption loss associated with the interruption. So there's still going to be an aspect, I think, that still has to be addressed on a different level by the businesses out there.
Okay. So one of the things I think you heard on the earlier panel as well is, as we try to structure conversations around these changes in the industry and regulation and everything else, is also to align to what's happening in the marketplace relative to a business risk. And so I think we've all dealt with, risk to reputation, risk to revenues, and obviously regulatory requirements. But what we've seen too is more dependence on cyber than ever before, which we all know. But also, if you think about healthcare, if you think about particular, utilities that are controlled by, SCADA and various other things, as well as moving vehicles now too. You've got cyber that now can be, I don't want to go to weaponized, but certainly influence the health of an individual. So one of the things we worry around is safety as well. So walk into an organization, understand the risk around safety aspects as well. Are you guys seeing any trends or associated elements of the marketplace there?
Yeah, I think, in particular, and just to reiterate, one of the bigger risks along the safety lines, but first is what's actually at stake when the revenue. I was looking at IBM's most recent report on cybersecurity, and these are real risks. The average breach is over $4 million, and for those breaches, especially in small and medium size, over 60% of those businesses are closing. We had Lincoln College last week, which is an HBCU that, they had a couple other things going on, but that was just like, what, we've had enough. We can't deal with this. And so, when we think about safety, education, these are real institutions that are being impacted and shut down because of these ransomware and other risks.
Okay. And then, if you look at a breach that you get a call on, what's your confidence when you first talk to a client about, are they really being breached? Do you guys walk them through a process of validating that indeed they've been breached versus just they got a phone call that said you've been breached, they've got a indication that there's been a breach? What would you guys think about helping a customer get to the point of understanding that?
Yeah, that's definitely the focus of the scoping call, just to kind of clear out some of the facts and see what's really going on, and to start collecting some of the obvious evidence. They have sometimes they have a case where they're in an office and the printers are spewing out ransom notes. I'm like, okay, you've got someone in your system, obviously. But then there's other situations where I always say it feels like a breach, definitely feels like one. Feel compromised, feel violated, but we're not technically there because, we go over what constitutes a breach by law. So I do make that one of the first things that I talk about. I don't go into I could talk about breaches for days, but I don't want to get into the weeds of that. Just wanted to respond to their immediate need and to really calm the room, while at the same time being realistic about what's going on.
I'd say, from a claims perspective, the policy triggers on, usually, typically, at least the policies I work with, on suspicion of breach. So we generally encourage people to contact us right away. We'll set up that scoping call. Try to get to the heart of it, and if it ends up, if everyone's in agreement, yeah, it feels like this is something, then it moves forward. If it fortunately turns out to be something else, that's not an issue as far as coverage is concerned. The policy is designed to kind of build through each stage, so it's not anything that people should be like, oh, should I call, should I not call? Although I do think that by the time we get the call, people pretty much know what they're dealing with, or they know that it's bad.
Yeah, when it comes to like phishing and business email compromise, we have, as the IT side, we'd rather them, send suspicious or send that type of activity to us beforehand, and then we can, investigate rather than wait and then something bad actually happen.
And if you look at the data exfiltration, if you look at the situation that occurs a lot of times, you may have a breach, i.e. somebody's in your system, to your point earlier, but how do you really think about data exfiltration to the point where we now declare a breach and who should declare a breach?
Yeah, there's obviously the kind of the obvious, right? If you have the right tooling in place, you'll start to be able to kind of see the activity, the logs, dig into that, and start to understand what that breach looks like.
Yeah, I think the data exfiltration is kind of putting the cart before the horse, right? The first thing you have to do is you have to get the actual artifacts so that you understand where the threat actor might have accessed and what they may have had. Then later leverage in terms of their laterals across the environment. And then once they got within that environment in different networks, you then try to figure out exactly what they may have taken, right? I can't tell you how many times a threat actor claims that they have data. There's no evidence forensically, and then, it's up to the insurer or the client whether they want to go ahead and pay. And then they're like, oh, and by the way, we'll destroy your data, but since we didn't take any data in the first place, so, ha ha.
Right. Yeah, I've seen a few of those. And who should be the first call? Because this is an experience that I've learned over the last 5 years, many times in this group, is I was at RSA, ran a hierarchy at RSA, 100% we were the first call for clients, from clients. And then I started in diligence and things like this, and the lawyers say, we're the first call. And then I talk to insurance providers, they say we should be the first call, but sometimes we are the first call. So like, if you're looking at the right process, who's the first call?
I mean, I can say from my perspective, we want to be the first call to get everything. We'll probably talk a little bit about the need to coordinate multiple types of services, to have legal in there right away to, extend attorney-client privilege and everything. Of course, the faster the forensics can get going, the faster we can start figuring out what our options are, what we can do. And so we try to put together a package for, and I think particularly for smaller, medium-sized insurers, that's a good way to go. For larger insurers, they might have much more sophisticated infrastructure, partners that they work with all the time. They may reach out to their MSP and say, I've got this, and then, things can go. And usually, from an insurance perspective, if they have the right product, they have more latitude to do those things. It'll get taken care of. But yeah, I mean, for me, particularly from my perspective, and particularly for smaller businesses, we would love to be first call.
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit on that. And similarly, we would expect as the IT provider to be the first call as well. The type of clients we work with in the SMB space, they maybe don't have an attorney that they know, who to call right away. So when they call us, we can get to work, verify that there is actually a breach, and then, start to segment that and go from there.
I feel like this is the perfect advertisement for why you should have a pre-breach policy in place, right? So, I mean, everyone should be the first call. These calls, a conference call, have a hotline set up, you're all good, everyone's going to join at the same time, which never happens. And so, yeah, I mean, what really should be going on is that you should have your game plan, right? Who are you going to call within the first 10, 15 minutes, right? How do I just, give them a quick heads up? How do I organize these people? Let me do this call one time really fast with everyone on the line. We get all the players there, right? It shouldn't necessarily be, let's go full out analytics, logistically, how are we going to run this? I need to start collecting. It needs to be game planned with everyone in the room so that we can do it the right way. And I think that pre-breach plan in place and leveraging the resources that you have, right? I mean, Beasley, they have a great policy, they have great people on panel. You can leverage that, you can utilize that if you have awareness of it, and you go through what you have and don't have conflicting internal policies with other insurance policies and other things out there. It really makes everyone's job a whole lot easier.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that you're right. That is really the reason why you should have an incident response plan. Identify who's doing what and when. But, you know, I guess realistically, even with the plan in place, it's hard to follow it strictly when you're in a moment of panic. It's a crisis, right? And so you're just thinking immediately, how do I restore? How do I remediate? Not, you know, I'm calling the lawyers. But eventually, that's the initial scoping call does have like 12, 13 people on it, and we do take the time to introduce each person to make sure like everyone's role is explained and all the different swim lanes are, you know, characterized appropriately, because it could get confusing and there are a lot of moving parts, and so I think that's part of our job to, you know, as part of the legal team to really just explain the process chapter by chapter. I think that helps a lot, and also when you talk about exfiltration, also it's important to really just make it a point to say, okay, that's something we're going to be looking for, not, not bringing things to the surface that you can't resolve immediately. But definitely, I think there are a lot of phone calls to be made.
I would say the worst call to get though is, you know, okay, we just wiped our servers, we're buying new ones, and what do you cover? Right? Like that's like and that's what we get sometimes, particularly again for small and short too. You know, they got an IT guy, you know, just it was ransomware there. I gotta
I
get
think
rid
they're
of it.
helping, right?
Yeah, and so, you know, I think it is important to have, you know, whoever that first call is, there should be someone who has experience to know that they're not going to be operating alone, that there's going to be a lot of other people and to know to preserve artifacts, to, you know, to make sure that they're taking the steps, and that quickly you're going to have to build a team of people to respond to this.
Yeah, I think from an IR perspective, our preference is the lawyer is long before we are, regardless of the process before there, because we will get subpoenaed all the time for information, and it will initially say, any information not under privilege, for us to identify what wasn't under privilege. And that's the whole process that we work, preferably with the lawyer on the case, to be able to defend when that started, when that, you know, what that process was, what that information was as well in that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know what happens when,
He's loud like me, so.
but I don't think we really need to know what happens, because we already know what happens if you retain IR, right, without having an attorney involved, right? We've all seen the results of that through the case law. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want to protect yourself, if you want to protect the company, IR is probably not the best one to go to first. You know, insurance companies, great choice, right? Knowing your counsel, who's your IR counsel, great choice. Get everybody on the phone real fast. I mean, and you can do it. I mean, we have the abilities, we have these hotlines, you know, we all have cell phones. I wish mine would stop ringing sometimes, but nonetheless, please don't have it stop ringing.
Okay, next slide.
I was just going to make a point. I think best practice that we advise our insureds on is to identify from your panel list, especially if you're with a Beasley on a BDR where you're restricted to their panel, to identify your privacy breach coach ahead of time, as soon as you are insured. Pick one, interview them, whatever you might, and then have a 30-minute onboarding call with them so they can walk you through. If you have an incident, these are the steps that are going to happen. And I can tell you that our insurers that have done that have then subsequently had an event, even if it was 2 years later, were like, because you're panicked, you know, you're under attack, you're panicked, we're like, oh wait, I know who I'm calling. And they have that immediate call, and then they can, you know, put all the players together. So if you have that initial onboarding call, you identify, and the other part of identifying your attorney ahead of time is to get the engagement letter language ironed out ahead of time, because the last time you want your general counsel arguing with your privacy counsel as to language and engagement letters when you're in the middle of a ransomware attack. So that's what we advise our insurers on.
Yeah, and I think we all agree too that insurance is a great first call because they will most likely either in-house or outside engage legal as well, because you don't want the exposure any more than, you know, the customer. Okay. So if you think about a forensics investigation, what would be some of the questions that you're looking for as part of the outcome? Obviously, initially up front, you have some things about is it a breach and so forth, exfiltration. But also, as you're thinking about the engagement overall, what are you thinking about, what you want to learn from this event, and what topics of data you want at the end of this event to help other policies in the future, make other recommendations, to update your ransomware questionnaire, et cetera, et cetera.
I'll take a stab at it. So, again, I would be claims and not in underwriting, so sometimes we just kind of wonder what they're doing over there. but it's
Not that you're a current firm, but
right. And every claims job like that. No, but no, but we see we see when things go bad, right? And so we're not looking to I mean, there is a huge focus, I think, right now in trying to understand what the better risks are, what the best risks are, and to be able to, just the way the market is, there's actually, I think, a lot of effort to be able to sort of rehabilitate, the shorts to get them to a point where, they're progressing. As far as what I'm looking for, I mean, the things I'm looking for immediately, I'll be honest, are the things that I'm like, how big is this going to be monetarily? Having backups, that's like real happy. It's a great moment. Not having to do notifications, another great moment. But it's difficult because I'm not the most technical person. But understanding that whether the insured has good things in place to prevent it, has backups, has these things. We still get claims in where there's none of that, or things were not configured correctly. So something was in place, but nobody checked it. So each claim is still sort of unfortunately unique in that way. You don't know what you're going to have until you get there. But
So my question is kind of one overarching question of where do you save or hold your sensitive data, if you have any? And so let's kind of make sure that we focus in on that aspect to determine whether or not that was accessed or exfiltrated from your system, right? It's always great news when they say, well, this is what they had, and then, access to, and then you say, okay, well, was any of that encrypted? Did any of it have any sensitive information associated with it? And so hopefully some of those safeguards have been implemented, and then hopefully backups as well. As I think Jason pointed out, backups are key in terms of trying to get restoration going. And certainly once they've had access or exfiltration of the data, it's not like you can go ahead and tell them to delete it and I can have provide notification, right? So I mean, it's really coming down to the, what do they actually do within the environment.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing is, to your point, is insurance is trying to understand where future threats are in current data, right? And so if you look at it from an IR firm perspective, a lot of them are not. Let's just get them fixed, move on next one. We bought a company last year, Security, which has my cyber scorecard risk quantification. And so we're trying to layer that on top of IR, where we're thinking about, okay, what industry are they in? What types of records do they have? The normal stuff that you guys ask, in underwriting. But also, did they have those things in that are in the ransomware questionnaire already? Did they have multi-factor authentication? Why did that happen? Did they have patching systems at a moderately good level? Not most people are going to attain the new objective of 7 days for all patching. That's going to be a hard one for a lot of companies to obtain. But if you think about all of the variables, you can start thinking about all the things we're doing to try to make it better, hygiene, multi-factor authentication, all those types of things. But where are these areas where we thought this was going to make it better, but in reality it got bypassed? Because we all know, no matter how good we get with all of the preventative, they're going to figure out ways around it. So things we can think about in advance of what we're seeing today is a great way to start databasing that, thinking about what other defenses and capabilities we have in the future as well.
I think sometimes you have to actually go even a little bit simpler than that. I mean, I just had a matter recently where the client thought it was the MSP's responsibility to do the software patching implementations, and the MSP thought otherwise, right? So the patches weren't getting put through. So I mean, you have to understand whose responsibility it is to do the work in the first place beforehand, and it's just the simplest things can be easily resolved. It's just better communications amongst people.
Yeah, and that means you're responsible for it. So contracts could get very, very long in nature. I don't know if you've seen contracts changing or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, delineating who's responsible for what, especially when it comes to a third party, you know, like an MSP, is very important. We're working a lot more with in-house IT as well, and as their partner, and to really understand, you know, what I'm responsible for as the MSP provider and what you're responsible for. And you know, the contract is continually to evolve, and it needs to be more because there's a lot at stake. And unless we get it right, unless it's understood, you know, it's really going to continue to be a struggle.
Yeah, and one of the things that we guide customers, especially if we have a planning session in advance, is who has the authority to define its breach, right? Because what you get on the first phone call, going back to records before, I think Noah was talking about this earlier, is there will be an email that says, "We were breached." You don't know if you were breached right now. You also just started a clock for regulatory requirements. So in our world, we tend to go, who's the highest executive that can make that final decision? Only that executive can make that final decision in a breach situation. I don't know if you guys have had challenges with any of that from a regulatory perspective or otherwise with who can declare this breach, or you know, if it's a lawyer that declares.
I mean, we have had a variety of types of ones, and I think, you know, clearly outlining that, it's going to depend on every organization, and most of the times you're going to want it to be that, you know, executive, or sometimes it's going to be the lawyer. It's really going to depend on a case-by-case basis as far as what we see.
Yeah, we try to make it our practice to borrow ourselves incident response counsel, not necessarily breach coaches, which I think is more popular out there because it sounds cooler, but we're happy to be uncool and help the client out a bit more.
Questions from the audience real fast before we keep going. Yeah. So one of the challenges on the IR side is making sure that as we go through this, we get the right questions from legal as to what we're answering, make sure that's under privilege, and so forth. But there's lots of standards out there. We talked about NIST earlier today. MITRE's got a framework and so forth. But really being able to understand that process is a key part of making sure that your plan includes a logically laid out step in how you're looking at data, how you're evaluating data, and so forth. Next slide. And then remediation. So one of the things we see all the time is customer wants to get up fast. They don't want to give us time to figure out backups, you know, any type of kernel information or any other type of information that we use for forensics sometimes. What's your guys' perspective relative to get me up now versus let's figure out what really happened and make sure that we've got a long-term protection in place? But I think it is fair to say you do see customers that rush sometimes get a repeat breach within days of the first breach.
I call that the CEO question, right? It's like they're just laser focused on how do we just get our orders back and running, our processing, whatever the business is. And we just have to work on putting things into perspective. Like obviously that's one of the more important issues for you, but we've got a long road here. We have a forensic investigation that has to complete. We have potential regulatory notifications as well as notifications to your customers, your employees, and also soft notifications to their partners and vendors depending on their contractual obligations. So it's really, the practice is to communicate and to educate and to make sure that everyone understands that yes, being operational is key, and we can focus on sort of the mission critical servers, systems, whatever you need. We can prioritize that, but not to lose sight of the entire big picture in terms of how a breach goes down.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is evaluating your risk as a business and the tolerance, right? If you have a breach, depending on the magnitude, if they're in business critical systems, well, you effectively could be shut down as a business. So every day that you're shut down, you're potentially losing revenue. So weighing that versus the potential risk of being hit again is definitely something to be considered, and another kind of CEO executive question that needs to be answered.
For me, the answer is both. Like, I want them to both be able to get the artifacts that they need to be able to look at the regulatory questions, notification issues, soft notification. But we also have business interruption coverage. I want them to get back up and running as quickly as possible, for us and the size of that potential claim. And look, I'm talking to us, but I mean, it's difficult to be with an insured through this process. The choices that they're facing in that period of time. There's no right answer. There's really no right answer, but really what we try to at least do is to get everybody working so that we can preserve what needs to be preserved and then immediately shift to them doing what they need to do to get back on their feet.
Yeah, I think all that's right. And then, just back to your point, Doug, I mean, I think there's an important aspect of reinfection, right? Somebody got into your system, somebody already made a mistake or left their door open, and so we don't want to leave that door open going forward. And if you're destroying all the artifacts and the evidence that we're going to rely upon, then you're really doing yourself a disservice on multiple levels, including leaving yourself vulnerable to having a second business interruption loss in a few more days, months, weeks, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think going back to the original comments you guys made about an IR plan, what we do find out if an IR plan is in place and they've done a tabletop where you ran them through this scenario, they are a lot more comfortable with pauses and delays and understanding it may take a little bit of time. And we're all better, right? Like used to, we could take days to collect all the information. Now that's a much more compressed period. But if they walk through that process and understand, hey, here is the process. I understand what's coming. Yes, it's not moving as fast as I want, but it will get there, in a reasonable period. They're much more comfortable with that, at least every time we've seen something. Okay, questions? White crowd? Okay. So litigation, from day one, you mentioned kind of early on, litigation's in the back of your mind. Any thoughts around any of these areas, that push you to make decisions during the process from a lesson learned perspective of areas to focus on in this? Obviously, exfiltration is a big element of that. What's under regulatory compliance, and keeping track of that obviously is a major thing these days, especially with all the state laws, federal laws, and then obviously international laws as well.
So litigation, big issue. It's happening a lot more. There's a lot more class actions out there. Definitely has an impact on what I advise our clients in terms of educating them about their risk level and their tolerance. One of the questions that we get asked, I think almost every single retention is, should I have a forensic report drafted? There's some question about whether that would even be covered, a lot of it, under a confidentiality, the attorney-client work product. I mean, a lot of the information that's going to be in the report, although there'll be conclusions, it's going to be factual as well. And facts don't really get protected under case law, right? And so if you're going to get rid of all the artifacts out there, and the only facts, which is a summary of it, is going to be nicely, concisely put together in a nice little report, then maybe you don't want to have that report, right? And so a lot of times that's a driving force in terms of having us educate our clients in terms of their decision-making process.
Yeah, and we saw that obviously with Capital One and being able to separate out data reports, the teams that are working on things and everything else, which is really hard for a small organization, right? Because those are typically the same people. So if you had one recommendation to make relative to breach as a general topic, what would you tell the audience? So it can be preventative, it can be think about, where you are, what you should be doing to prevent the breach.
Where I step in, where the breach has already occurred, I think just coming off that prior question, patience is really key, right? So we're talking about this tension between wanting to just respond to it, get back. I've had insureds that you can tell, you start talking, you might have to do notifications. They don't want to hear it. They're sticking their head in their sand. They just want to get back to business, move past the moment. patience is really key, where we've had insureds overreact and run off and do something that they felt they needed to do. One example being a nonprofit that felt like they needed to let their donors know right away, that there was a trust issue in their mind there. We tried to say, listen, just calm down. They went and they said, well, this will be covered. They went and they notified everybody, and they came back and bit them. I wish they had a little bit more patience. It's where it's critical to rely on counsel, and we really try to get the insurance to understand that that's, for a lot of reasons, their quarterback in responding to these situations.
Yeah, I'd say it's all about managing the end users at this point. A lot of the business email compromise is the first entry point to most breaches, and your end users who are on their kid's MacBook or their kid's Windows device that is not under your data, that's where it's happening. And so making sure you not only make them hyper aware and have a security training and awareness culture, but also make sure you're managing those endpoints, hopefully in a good way.
So I think if I had to pick one, it would be, like, to quote Shrek, right? I mean, it's like an onion, right? I mean, you peel it back and there's all these different layers, and you just have to have a way of addressing it, and hopefully the onion doesn't make yourself cry, right?
Which it always does.
Yeah, so as part of our best practices, we almost always provide a communications guidelines memorandum, and that's really just like the do's and don'ts of what to say, what not to say, how to say it, avoiding words like breach, hacker, attack, things of that nature. And so really, again, going back to my education point, it's like giving them that foresight to say, okay, you're a hospital, so there's a little known laws known as HIPAA, and we're looking at the size of your environment, the likelihood of this being over 500 individuals, and just really preparing them for not just litigation, but what we know is definitely going to come, the inevitable OCR investigation.
That's a disappearing act. So I think you guys touched on a lot of great things. You kind of dive into the technical side a little bit. The one thing that I've seen in this industry is everybody has over-rotated on, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to have a breach. And I think that's taken some of the hygiene off of the marketplace, some of the pressure to improve the hygiene. Now we're seeing regulation come back around that's now pushing to make sure hygiene is in place. But we were talking, obviously we had Log4j over the holiday and stuff, and a lot of clients are like, what should we be doing? And it's like, well, the same stuff we've been telling you for 14 years, right? Patch management, multi-factor authentication, all of those types of things, 24/7 monitoring, are just critical hygiene things. If people can start focusing on those now, driven by regulation will help. It'll get better and better. And obviously, we didn't touch specifically on some of the SEC laws coming up or regulatory movements that are coming up, but a lot of people believe those are as big as, if not better than, some of the GDPRs as drivers as well. So, we won't touch on that today. But okay, questions and
we got about 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Any comments on law enforcement? How can you call that pre-breach, coordinating, and thoughts on that? And then post-breach, sort of at what point maybe the insurer or the client in this case should be getting involved and help figure out essentially where they stand.
Yeah, real fast, if you didn't hear that, when should law enforcement be engaged all the way through the process, before breach, after breach, during breach?
So my approach is inform law enforcement when you have something to tell them that's meaningful. If you're going to inform them for purposes of so generally I'm thinking FBI and IC3 complaints, and so those are recommended, not required. And I think it's about timing. It's about giving the right information to the right people at the right time. And so when it comes to law enforcement, a lot of times our clients will inform the local police. They had a fraudulent wire transfer. They called their bank, and they're going nowhere, and they're just kind of like in circles. And then, we'll step to the plate and say, okay, let's also inform the FBI, try to get some coordinated effort here. But when you have information that's valuable, I would recommend providing it. In the case of a ransomware, oftentimes we don't have the most information that's valuable early on. So I would say somewhere in the middle stage of the breach process and incident response process, which of course doesn't help you in terms of an actual timeline, but that's my answer, my opinion.
Yeah, I would just add, like, there used to be 5-10 years ago, a lot of early on learning by different groups that are no longer like that. I mean, the FBI doesn't come storm in and take your servers and take them away, right? So, like, some of those rumors / maybe a few realities don't happen like that. Truly, we have not seen a problem with confidentiality, i.e., somehow this information being used for you, against you, in a court case or anything like that. Again, there may be some that I'm not aware of, but I would say law enforcement has definitely changed to help, and a lot of proactive notification, especially from the FBI and sometimes Secret Service as well.
Yeah, I feel like everyone wants to catch the bad guys, right? They're all so upset when you're on the phone and this has been an attack on my business. Like, it doesn't take much convincing to say, so if you want to let law enforcement know, they're like, okay, what's the number? What do I do? And they're all over it. They just want to catch the bad guys. And so even if it's not specifically going to give them immediate relief on their lost money maybe, or their lost business, right? They still want to help catch them for the next time, for the next person, because they really do care about other people out there as well. And they don't want to be the next victim either.
Right. One more question. And then
It seems like, sorry, I'm not a microphone guy. It seems like everything is, as far as reaction-wise, and who else needs to know, and reporting, and all that coordinated effort that's critical. But as far as, is there a mitigation before litigation strategy? What type of training the human capital programs would have an effect on underwriting certain insurance for cyber risk? And organizationally, if you have people and you're training on the human capital side of it, does that overall have an impact on occurrence, overall risk reduction, and the limited amount, I guess, lessening the amount of times that you have to go through this process, and how do you train on the left of boom as opposed to the reactionary actions of right of boom?
Yeah, good question. That's a lot of what we focus on is kind of the preventative, the ahead of time. First, making sure you're doing a deep risk analysis, deep vulnerability scanning, probably on a regular basis, so you can find those gaps and those holes ahead of time. Making sure you have the people in place to stay up with patch updates. We do have ways to do simulated phishing tests and that type of education, which we do catch people, and then they have to take that training, and it's kind of having that culture. So those are some of the ways that we implement to help our clients stay safe.
Yeah, I would just add, in every step of the process, you just identified people is the problem, people are the solution. And so the more they're trained on the left, the better things will get. The more they're trained to deal with a breach, i.e. IR plan and so forth, the better you're going to be. So we're not going to take people out of the problem, so we might as well put people, well-trained people in to solve the problem. So, okay, thank you very much, guys.